All right, well, it is noon, so I will just kick us off. I'm sure we'll have more people jump on as they settle into the lunch hour. But it's my pleasure to welcome you to another Lunch and Learn webinar presented by the Diversity and Equity Committee of the Minnesota APA chapter. We're really excited to have been doing these series. So if you've joined us in the past, you know these Lunch and Learns are typically tying together some part of the planning practice with equity. And so today we have a presentation from Kristen and Matt from the Metropolitan Council, who will introduce themselves a bit and talk about how they have rethought a data set from concentrated poverty to thinking more about equity and using that data in their work that they do at the Met Council and how cities can use that today. We are recording this session, so if you have to pop off early for another meeting or you want to revisit it, it will be on the APA-MN YouTube channel. And this is eligible for 1 CM credit, so yeah, just remember not to forget to log that. And finally, I just want to thank Stantec. They have sponsored these series over the last year, and we're grateful for their sponsorship. So with that, I'll turn it over to Matt and Kristen.
Thanks, Peggy Sue. I think can speak for Kristen. We've really been looking forward to this conversation and broadening this audience a bit. It's a project that we're really proud of and have put a lot of effort into and think is pretty valuable. So looking forward to speaking about it. So I am Matt Schroeder. I'm a principal researcher at the Met Council. Some of you may know me if you haven't been part of our engagement sessions for this project as one of the population estimates people at the Met Council. So a lot of Census Bureau data, housing data, just trying to pull things together to make sense of the region. And I'll let Kristen introduce herself.
Thanks, Matt. And hi, everyone. Kristen Rybatura is a senior researcher on the community development team at Met Council. I do work on racial inequities, affordable housing, but I'm also very involved in the production of our research products and making sure that they feel relevant and easy to use for all the folks we hope that find benefit in them. So really glad to be with you all today.
All right, I think I've got the right window up, so let's keep our fingers crossed. We are, all right, great. I think that's it. So today we are going to be doing a few things. One is just providing an overview of this equity considerations data set. In case you're wondering why it's called equity considerations, you will find out. So we're going to talk about why it even exists, what's in it, how to access it, the upcoming things we're going to add to it, and then a little bit of how to access it. We will later have some live polling to, as we try to kind of expand how this tool gets used to inform that, but hoping to allow plenty of time for Q&A and discussion as well. So as you may know, this story kind of begins with the Met Council's efforts to highlight areas of concentrated poverty, which came out of a report that we needed to do as a condition of a HUD grant. So as part of that, we had to define census tracts where at least 40% of residents had incomes below 185% of the federal poverty threshold. So basically high rates of people in poverty. We also defined the subset of ACPs that had at least 50% or more of people in color. So we did this, we kept updating them every year, dutifully published reports every year, updating these, the map. But, you know, as this went on and we got more feedback from community partners and stakeholders and local government staff, we really started to take a step back and think more broadly. So if we're trying to influence the lives of people in poverty, which is really the focus of this effort to advance equity, we needed to consider several more things, one of which is the fact that poverty exists across the region, and that less than a third of people in poverty are not living in an area of concentrated poverty. So we're really narrowing the scope of people that we're reaching through this effort on areas of concentrated poverty. Much of this slide summarizes what I just talked about, but the real point here is that as we move into the next regional development planning cycle, as we start to update our what will become the update slash replacement slash whatever to Thrive MSP 2040, our current regional plan, we wanted to really, again, take a step back and ask whether the stories and the measures and the whole focus of equity, whether this focus on concentrated poverty is really what's needed to advance equity in the region. And so we we undertook this project, listening, first getting a whole lot of feedback, understanding how areas of concentrated poverty were used, feedback from the Met Council members themselves, the Equity Advisory Committee, local government staff, probably including some of you, and other users. And so we really took that to heart, trying to understand the value that people saw in this, as well as the drawbacks and inadequacies. And so we really started to think hard about how this concept does very tangible harm to neighborhoods, and how we wanted to shift things to really think about how we engage with people, rather than trying to treat areas of concentrated poverty as problems that need to be solved. And so out of this came a digital report called Rethinking Areas of Concentrated Poverty, just summarizing this whole effort. But to really dig in now, to four themes that we heard during those listening sessions, the feedback that we got. First, the idea that it is really important to have a shared understanding of the equity landscape in the region. We heard that a lot of communities don't have dedicated research staff for themselves. And so the Metropolitan Council, as an organization that serves communities, is an important part of that, and kind of tying together this regional narrative into something that can coordinate the region's efforts to advance equity, both inside and outside the Met Council. We also heard a lot of tension that local government staff especially felt between investments and displacement. On the one hand, they had a strong interest in, they wanted to create policies and tools that support equitable development. They wanted to counter the disinvestment that had happened in the past. And yet, they felt a tension there between that and the possibility that these investments would in turn attract higher income people to the neighborhood, and kind of, which has the potential at least to push out the very people that they were trying to, whose lives they were trying to improve. And so to help with that, I think we saw a need for more data on capital flows and investments. So how money goes in to certain areas, and what comes out. We also heard very strongly that this whole focus on concentrated poverty really supports and reinforces a deficit-based narrative that, as I said before, treats these neighborhoods as problematic, and things that need to be fixed and saved. And in addition to the tangible harm in kind of devaluing the assets in these neighborhoods, ignoring the rich culture and huge array of businesses and nonprofit organizations that call these areas home. It just kind of led to a situation where kind of this mindset that any investment is needed, rather than really trying to think about what people there need. And so we heard a request to balance that picture by broadening the focus to include the other end of the income spectrum as well, concentrated affluence, to go beyond poverty rates and highlight the many, many ways that neighborhoods differ, and then as well to provide more specific and disaggregated data so that people could really dig into the diversity and not simply use poverty as a proxy for every single thing that a neighborhood might need. And finally, we heard calls that our research needs to reflect all voices, to reflect people's lived experiences, not to rely solely on sources of quantitative data, which are great for many reasons, but also have a lot of limitations, as well as to give something back. We're asking people for feedback. We need to give them back things that they can use and to make that information useful. And so as we thought about what to do, we, as I mentioned, created this digital report and then the equity considerations data set that Kristen will describe now.
Thanks, Matt. So yes, as Matt said, our way of responding and really addressing what we felt are the harms that this concentrated poverty focus and analysis annually was creating for neighborhoods. We addressed that by creating a new tool, creating a new analysis to replace the concentrated poverty focus. And that's where we arrive at equity considerations for place-based advocacy and decisions in the Twin Cities region. Just rolls right off the tongue. And so we're going to talk a little bit. Next slide, please, Matt. So we're going to just describe a little bit about what we've been doing, maybe a couple of space bars, Matt, just to. Yeah, so in 2020, we took that step of creating and publishing the Rethinking Digital report, as well as the first iteration of equity considerations, which was pretty pared down, considering what it looks like today. We presented that information and let council staff and jurisdiction staff who we've been engaging know that this replacement was happening, and the reasons why. So a little bit about what you just heard from Matt. This year in 2021, we kicked off the year in February, publishing a greatly expanded equity considerations data set, as well as a user guide. And since then, we've been doing lots of presentations like this one, both inside with council staff and outside with jurisdictions and other organizations that have invited us to come talk about this resource to raise awareness about this. We've also been thinking about our technical assistance and how can we go beyond the data set to really have this be a helpful resource for folks, regardless of sort of your data savvy or your infrastructure, and hopefully in ways that also accommodate all of our largest constraint, which is time. So how can we really address that through technical assistance and through interactive tool development, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And then we do have some plans that we'll share and talk about in terms of our next expansion. Next slide, please, Matt. Probably another one. Yeah, there we go. Just to add a little bit to that, the equity considerations data set, our intention is for this to be kind of a live data set. We want to dialogue, we want to hear what works, what doesn't work, where you might need more information. And so, there will be periodic updates to it. And we definitely want to make sure that folks are aware when those new releases happen. So here are some of the principles of the equity considerations data set. And I think that they're going to make a lot of sense given what Matt just shared about what we heard in our listening sessions during the Rethinking project. But these are really the 5 that we keep top of mind when we are pursuing new data or thinking about just the overall purpose of this resource. The first is to really integrate topics. So Matt mentioned just a few minutes ago that folks wanted more holistic information, not just a focus on concentrated poverty, but how can we really integrate a variety of characteristics, a variety of planning topics, right? The Met Council, we're as susceptible as anyone else to kind of living with our silos, having housing here and parks here and transportation here. If we want to look at data more holistically, it makes sense to create more holistic data sets without maybe completely repackaging the American Community Survey data, but we certainly want to make sure that there's a great cross section of information so that you can use data in ways that are more holistic, and it's just all right there at your fingertips. sort of principles 2 and 3 are kind of flip sides of the same thing, where we really are interested in, people-centered place-based strategies, which means that we need to know about both people and places. So we have a balance of characteristics that look at both of those things, and making sure that we're not getting maybe too focused on one side versus the other, so that, again, we can have these nuanced and holistic portraits of both places and residents. The fourth principle, disaggregate wherever possible. This is a really important one to us, and certainly something we heard very strong themes on during our engagement. Information on race and ethnicity, information on, variables by tenure, wherever we can really pull apart and get more granular and more specific on a particular, topic, that's what we want to do. That can really help enhance our understanding of conditions on the ground or challenges that folks are facing. And it really adds a richness to our understanding when we can dig into that disaggregated data. We'll have some examples about that. And then lastly, trends, including historic information, which Matt is going to talk about, as well as maybe forecast and future information, so far as we know it. Really wanting to help provide some contextual information, so that you don't have to do all of that analysis yourself, but you have some variables that can easily describe change, that can be accessed about, sort of our historic legacies of redlining and racially restricted covenants, and bring that information into the present. So these are the principles that undergird this resource, that we, like I said, keep top of mind as we are producing more data and tools to support it. Next slide, please, Matt. So one of the things that you will see in our user guide, I think it's maybe even page 1 or 2, is that we, as much as we love our data, and we do, we want to really lift up the message that alone, this or any data set is incomplete and inadequate for advancing regional equity. So what that means is that, our quantitative data can get us so far. It can help illuminate, especially when it's disaggregated. It can help us, better understand, policy questions, challenges, characteristics of people, all of that great information, but it's really only one way of understanding the world. Even if we added hundreds of more fields of data, we would just reproduce the problem that kind of got us here, which is thinking that we have all the answers we need to make, solid decisions on behalf of residents without actually engaging them and talking to them. And so we really do feel strongly that while we think this is a great resource, and we're hoping that it makes, data more accessible, easier to use, and maybe lifts the burden off of some time, that time should be spent then perhaps engaging and refining with that engagement with the residents and folks that are directly affected. So we really we want to underscore, bold, highlight this message, and really just acknowledge the limitations and center that need for engagement. Hugely important. Next slide, please, Matt. So this is just an overview of what is in equity considerations. We have over 300 fields of data for the region census tracts. They span all the categories that you see here. We're going to unpack some of that for you, but we've also provided some ways for you to browse those fields without necessarily downloading the whole data set. So we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Next slide, please, Matt. I think one thing that's really important to touch on is that while we have added all of this great information into equity considerations, there's one thing that you will not find in it. And that is that we have stopped, the Metropolitan Council has stopped identifying areas of concentrated poverty where the majority of residents are people of color, or ACP 50s. This was known as. This is the subset of concentrated poverty Matt talked about earlier. Again, through those listening sessions and through that engagement, we heard strongly that, there have been concerns and limitations about this measure from the get-go, as we produce that choice, place, and opportunity report. And ACP 50s, they kind of had they had their moment where they were a snapshot of residential segregation in our metro. They were intended, this subset specifically was intended to highlight that people of color are disproportionately exposed to concentrated poverty, regardless of their own income level. Okay, but as we moved away from the in-depth, 100+ page report that really makes those connections and explicitly talks about these issues, and just started to produce an annual data set and annual reports that didn't go into all that context and depth, we were seeing the unintended consequences of ACP 50s really come to the surface. As I mentioned, rightful objections from the start from advocates and organizers. We're highlighting census tracts on a map and saying, high poverty, community of color, this is a problem. Well, that's a problem. Doing that is a problem. And so, this is part of the reason why we're no longer explicitly identifying ACP 50s. There's these other implications that, BIPOC communities are inherently problematic, or low-income communities are inherently problematic. And this creates stigma. This actually, creates tangible harms that organizers and other folks that advocate for community needs on the ground reported back and said, we're encountering this as a challenge for, really communicating what our community needs, because we're being told, well, you're an ACP 50, and so this can't happen, or this can happen. And that was certainly not the council's intention in using this. And so, again, we can stop that cycle by no longer explicitly identifying this and inviting folks to use equity considerations to more thoughtfully intersect race with other variables, with other points of information. And lastly, again, I just sort of hammered home the point about community engagement and how important it is. We were also finding that ACP 50s, folks were incorporating ACP 50s into equity metrics or, discussions, again, as like that proxy for maybe other things that community members need. But what we've learned in our annual analysis is that, these places were sharing a poverty rate and not much else. And so this was not a good proxy for really digging into what would be effective policy or programs for those places. And so having something like ACP 50s to fall back on was kind of creating this spatial shorthand where we could sort of substitute and use them as a proxy. And we don't want to see that happen. So that you will not see ACP 50s in the data set explicitly. Is it possible to recreate them with the information that is in the data set? Yes, it is. But we would strongly urge you to think about some alternatives, and we've included many of them in the data set. So next slide, please, Matt. As Matt said earlier, one of the ways that we have brought parity, I would say, to this conversation around income inequality and concentrations is by creating a variable that names concentrated affluence. Because the same systems that create concentrated poverty also create, neighborhoods of advantage or concentrated affluence. And so if our intention is to really talk about systems and systems affecting outcomes, then looking at both sides of this, both extremes of this continuum makes a lot of sense to us. So that we're not just talking about concentrated poverty, we're talking about these broader patterns, what they look like and how they manifest in our region. So we recommend consistently pairing those two fields, concentrated affluence and poverty. And in our data set, we have kind of the iterations of concentrated poverty and affluence over time based on the American Community Survey. So you don't just get, the most current, you can also look back over time, which is what this map is showing here. I think I'm going to turn it back to you, Matt, to talk about legacy data and historic data.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. So we put together four, I guess, specific use cases, examples of how you might consider using the data, just to make this a bit more concrete. So the first one that I'll talk about is, as Kristen mentioned, looking at disinvestment and discrimination, which is one thing that we heard pretty clearly from our from the people who participated in our listening sessions, that we needed to talk about the root causes of those systems, those factors that did create both concentrated affluence and concentrated poverty, to make the point that these areas just didn't pop onto the map randomly. They were created by certain policies, and we need to understand that if we're going to create policies that counter that. One thing that we've done is to put in redlining data from the Homeowners Loan Corporation maps that influenced at least how much credit was going to go into mortgage loans in each of these neighborhoods. This exists only for Minneapolis and St. Paul, but we also have racially restrictive covenant data from the Mapping Prejudice Project at the U of M. And so this is, these, as you probably know, were language in deeds, property deeds that made it impossible for people who were not white, typically Black, Indigenous, sometimes Asian or Jewish people, to buy these properties. Neither of these really exists in a format that's easy to work with. In a way that you can look at the correspondence between other data sources, primarily thinking about American Community Survey data, so summary data on neighborhoods and census tracts. So the covenant data, for example, exists at the parcel level. So we can look for individual properties at which properties had covenants attached to them. And then to help it play nicely with other data sources, we've summarized this to census tracts. So the share of today's single family homes that had covenants attached to them. So you can see the correspondence there. And so as a result, it is possible to look at the relationship between covenants and percent white. Today's percent white, the share of the population that identifies as white non-Latino. Darker shades here indicate higher share of this population that identifies white. And as you would expect, there's it can be tough to see these relationships from a map alone, but at least there are many examples where areas with a lot of covenants are whiter than other areas. We can also look at that with respect to affluence. So again, darker shades of green here indicate higher rates of affluence in the tract. And so again, tracts with more covenants often have higher shares of affluent people today. As I said, it's tough to draw those conclusions from a map alone. And there's definitely a lot of variation in that pattern. So you can just as easily find tracts that did have covenants and yet have relatively low shares of affluent people. So to get a sense of just that overall pattern, understanding that in any given community, this relationship may not hold, but thinking region-wide at the broader factors that went along with this, it is, I think, important to understand that when we look at each census tract, which is a circle on this chart, as you move to the right and you get higher shares of racially restrictive covenants, at least in that, like moving from no covenants up to about a 20%, 10 to 20% share of covenants, you see an increase in the percent white. So there's kind of like this threshold, once you get up to about, excuse me, 10 to 20% share of existing single family homes with covenants, you see that the share of white people remains pretty high. Same with the percent of affluence people. So once you get up to about 10% of existing single family homes with covenants, you start to see higher rates of affluence that largely remain. Just an example, I mean, again, there's lots of variation. This is by no means deterministic, but just trying to look at these, I guess, considerations, these patterns that might be useful in thinking about how to look at the past and address that. And I'll turn it over to Kristen to talk about that second use case.
Yeah, so engagement. We describe in our user guide how equity considerations data set can support community engagement efforts just by virtue of providing detailed information about residents and about on the ground conditions in some cases, so that you can really understand who you're trying to reach and where they're located, and perhaps set targets and just really leverage this data in that way. So I'm just going to walk through a quick example, kind of taking maybe my council hat off for a second and putting some work I do outside of the council, volunteer work with my community organization on, we were able to leverage equity considerations to understand and form some strategy around renter outreach and tenant protections work. Before I jump into that, next slide, please, Matt, just wanted to present this overview. So, one of the most exciting components of equity considerations is that we now have really detailed information on 55 cultural groups. In addition, we have, the major race groups that the census uses, but we're really particularly excited about these cultural groups. So here we have mapped the percent of African-American residents. You can see, the legend here, 25 or more are that darkest green category, and then we, have different buckets from there. And then next slide, please, Matt. And this, refines that major race group of Black residents by looking specifically at the share of residents that identify as sub-Saharan African. And so you can see how this changed, the way that the coloration of the map here by getting more specific about a particular cultural group. Yes, thanks. So again, we're getting into heightened specificity about who we're talking about, because we know that these communities are not monolithic, and we really need to be precise and thoughtful in our engagement. Next slide, please, Matt. So kind of taking this use case of engaging renters on St. Paul's West Side. So if you're not familiar, the West Side is a community in St. Paul, south of downtown. Confusing, that it consists of 4 census tracts. We had some goals with this particular engagement. We wanted to better understand, what the data tell us about conditions for renters, and we wanted to better understand how to target resources like, language translation, what cultural events to look for to make sure that information on tenant protections and rental assistance was reaching the populations that needed it. Next slide, please. And so, when we look at these 4 census tracts and we dig into some of the numbers there with regard to, renter and tenure, we came to understand that there were 2 census tracts, one that had a particularly high share of renters, and then one just that had a particularly high share, just a high number of renters. And so, those were areas to really hone in on. But as you can see, we have a lot of detailed information about renters, about housing units, and rental unit size. So this is just a sampling of the information that's related to rental housing that we were able to access and think about in this engagement. Next slide, please, Matt. We have some, again, some change data that, again, helped us understand, at a broader level, what are the conditions on the ground that our lowest income renters on the West Side are experiencing. And on the left-hand side, you can see in 2014, we had, the share of housing affordable to households with incomes at or below 30%. Of AMI, area median income. And so you can see that, we had a relatively, okay share, of housing available or housing affordable to those lowest income households. But then by 2019, you can see that, several of the census tracts are in a lighter color, which means that there were fewer housing units affordable to these households. So, that this is just really, affirming the market pressures that our lowest income households that rent on the West Side are experiencing. Next slide, please, Matt. And using the more detailed information on race and cultural communities, we were able to, dig into the demographics of our community and understand, what resources are needed, where, when it came to, language, when it came to, tapping into the community resources and hubs related to these different communities. So I recognize this is a little hard to see. It's not ideal, but this is the type of information that we were able to use to craft those engagement strategies. So we can see that there is a large Hispanic or Latino population on the West Side. It's a higher share in some areas versus others. But then when we dug into the cultural communities groupings, we saw that folks that identify as having Mexican origin, that group in particular was the large share of folks that were identifying as Latino. Similarly with Asian, we can see that we have a high share of Asian residents in one of our census tracts at 22%, so like one in five. And then we looked into the cultural communities related to the broader Asian category and really came to understand that it was specifically Hmong residents that we would engage again in that same census tract. And so, again, it's all about refinement. It's all about understanding, who's going to be impacted and making sure that you can reach them. And equity considerations helps us do that to a greater extent. I think that's the end of that example, Matt, but we have some other ways that we've used this information.
Yeah, and I'll try to go through them pretty quickly because I know we're running a little behind schedule. One thing that we were particularly interested in doing was helping people understand neighborhood change. We know this has a lot of relevance for those debates over gentrification and displacement that people are really concerned about. But we also hear that a lot of suburban cities are encountering these issues as well. Just more broadly, the aging population or trends in home values and housing costs. So we really wanted to help them understand that as well. One of the things that's in the data set that can help people do that is to look at when residents moved into their current home. So how mobile is the population? Are census tracts getting an influx of newer people, or are they populated mostly by people who have been around for a while? In most places, definitely not all, the homeowners tend to stick around. So darker shades here indicate places where at least half the population moved into their current home after 2015. And that's true for the downtown area of Minneapolis. So condo developments there. And other places in the region as well. But when we look at renters, though, obviously much more mobile than homeowners, as you'd probably expect. But I think it's also important to note that in a lot of places, they've lived in their home for a while. So including many areas of Minneapolis and St. Paul, as well as all cities where at least half the population moved into their current home before 2015. This is, I should say, this does reflect the whole 2015 to 2019 period, but it's not as though people are moving every single year. So again, I think it can help tease out whether change is happening because new people are moving into the tract or neighborhood, or whether the population is changing just because the people who live there already are changing. And so one of the ways we can dig into that more is by looking at home values and housing costs. Estimated home values have increased across the region, as probably not a surprise, but more dramatic gains in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Of course, there are a lot of reasons for this. One is probably that they are, at least between 2014 and 2019, as we, again, continue to come out of that Great Recession, they are starting from a lower base, lower values. So an increase in value would result in a higher percent increase. But still important to think about just from the perspective of residents in these areas. whether they can continue to pay property taxes, and whether people who live in those neighborhoods, and if you're renting, can still afford to buy in them as well. And speaking of rent, this looks much more like a patchwork quilt. Here, bluer shades indicate higher increases in rent, and orange shades represent lower or higher declines in rent. So there are a lot of places where rents are declining, but overall, most places are seeing higher rents, especially in, I guess areas of South Minneapolis, St. Paul jump out, but also in several suburban cities too, Maplewood, Golden Valley, Edina. So again, certain things to think about, and not just for a specific community, though. I think that's really useful, but also comparing it to other cities and understanding the region-wide or county-wide, or just like immediate trend in your community and surrounding communities, for example. So again, there can be lots of reasons why that would be. Is it because there's new development happening that happens to be higher value, since most of the housing that's been built is market rate and targeted toward higher income renters? Or is it that properties that have existed for a long time are themselves increasing in rent? So one of the things that that this data set allows people to do is to overlay different characteristics on top of each other. So here we can look at changes in rent zoomed in to part of Dakota County, with the change in housing units between 2010 and 2019. So for example, that tract in the southwestern corner of Apple Valley, high rent change, but not a lot of new development. Indicates that probably these increases in rents are happening among existing properties, whereas the tract kitty corner to that, to the northeast, in Burnsville, um, uh, again, blue rent increases, but more new development, which suggests possibly that those rent increases are driven more by new development rather than by increases in rents in existing properties. Again, not not a certainty by any means, but just again, one of many considerations to think about as a jumping off point for considering different policies or programs, and then to look at in more detail using local knowledge. And then finally, thinking about a particularly hot topic, I really did not intend that pun, climate adaptation. Where might I want to target efforts to mitigate the effects of climate change? One of the things that we put in was surface temperatures. So this was in the middle of a heat wave in, I believe, 2016. And so looking at the surface temperature at noon, so darker shades of red indicate areas that have particularly high temperatures, in contrast to places in yellow. So again, as is probably not a surprise, areas closer to Minneapolis and St. Paul tend to have higher temperatures. But we can also, again, look at how these things layer on top of each other, and to see that communities of color tend to be more exposed to extreme heat, so that each dot represents 25 residents of color. So they tend to be concentrated more in those orange and red areas that are hotter, not as much in those lighter orange and yellow areas that tend to be cooler, relatively cool in the middle of a heat wave. And there's other things that go along with climate change too. We put in data on flood vulnerability, solar potential. So many things to look at. We did also want to highlight a couple examples, concrete examples, that the Met Council has been doing. So in our environmental services division, their water resources group is using this data set to create a priority waters list for the region to highlight for special protection. So looking at areas that given characteristics of transportation, environment, equity, really trying to bring those into the decision-making process about what makes it onto this list. And then second, our Livable Communities Act team in community development is now creating project data profiles for LCA applicants. So looking at the characteristics of areas surrounding new proposed developments that cities might be applying for funding to assist with. And so this, because LCA Livable Communities also cares about the potential impacts of development on the community, this helps communities and applicants answer those questions and make a case for why their project is particularly well suited. I did want to say just a little bit about how this data is organized. Right now, it is basically in 6 Microsoft Excel workbooks. Definitely not ideal. We are working on that. But for now, there's a complete file with every single one of those 300 some fields. There's a reduced file that's a bit easier to work with just those most commonly requested fields, and 4 more with just organized by topic. And then we also have for people with GIS experience, geospatial layers available through the Minnesota Geospatial Commons. We also publish I guess you'd call it a data dictionary. Again, identifying the topic for each of these fields with the name, where in those that set of 6 Excel files you can find it, as well as a description of what those mean. We will be going into what's coming up next. We're looking forward in early 22 to updating the census data that we put in, providing more geographies and a lot more topics, especially putting in some more data on amenities, the resources that tracts have. Later on, things that will take a bit more time to gather, but definitely open to more ideas. And here's where I think I turn it back to you, Kristen.
I think in the interest of time, I'm just going to breeze through these next couple slides, and so we can have a break for questions. And then we do have that live polling exercise that we hope to get to. So we'll see. But yes, as I mentioned earlier, right now we're really in sort of the spreading the word, raising awareness about this resource. You can see some of the groups that we've talked with, and this is part of why we were excited to join you all today, because we have so many great folks from across the region and state with us and on this call. There are a couple, additional newsletter articles, a podcast that we've done. Again, just trying to make sure that this is on folks' radar, and especially as we expand into tools and other things that increase access to this information. Next slide, please, Matt. We've also been thinking about, again, moving, going beyond the data set. I believe with the concentrated poverty analysis, there was maybe all of 3 paragraphs spent on that in Thrive MSP 2040, and then no additional information about how to actually operationalize that particular analysis. But we want to learn from that. And we've created this user guide, as I mentioned earlier. It really does kind of lay out these 4 topic areas that have really been topic areas that have come directly from our user base. So, general tips and considerations, resources for that effective engagement that I talked about earlier, the annotated list of use cases. So, when is this a good fit and when might not it be, and for what reasons? So, that's not exhaustive by any means, but we just wanted to provide a little bit of guidance and inspiration to users about how they could incorporate equity considerations. And then we have some additional information about data sources and limitations, including some detailed information as to how we created those 55 cultural groups. So, it's a great resource. We recommend that, you take a look, page through that. And certainly if you have additional questions on anything, you can always get in touch with us. But so this is part of that going beyond the data set, providing some great technical assistance and resources, and thinking about kind of the next steps there. That's where we'll ask you some questions about yourself, how you use data, what do you value in interactive tools. But before we get into that, live polling, I just want to break really quick for some questions. I see that there is one in the chat from Jan Youngquist and Hopkins. How do you see this information informing the development of the next regional development guide? I have a very quick answer to that, and then Matt, you might have something to add. I will say that, since we have stopped identifying ACP 50s, this has sort of forced a new series of conversations around equity metrics and how thoughtful equity metrics can be incorporated into policy, into evaluation, into implementation of programs, without something kind of spatial shorthand like ACP 50s to rely on. Folks are needing to really think about who might be impacted by policies, how can those outcomes be tracked. And so we've been already engaged in some great conversations on that, from everything ranging from criteria used for assessing applications like LCA, regional solicitation. There was also some criteria around the regional bike network. So these are some areas in which we've been engaging and been thinking about, if we make this data accessible, and incorporate it into scoring in a thoughtful way, this moves us beyond the concentrated poverty framework into something that is hopefully more targeted and more comprehensive. So that's one way. Matt, do you have other responses to that or thoughts on Jan's question?
I guess I would just say that with the focus on engagement, I think I would say that in some way this is up to people outside the council as well to, and I guess Kristen was kind of getting at this, but to kind of come up with, like, to take these topics, these considerations, and feed them back into the council as things to prioritize in the regional plan. But I guess that's all I would say.
Any other questions to ask at this point in time, or should we move on to live polling?
We did have a question of where we can find the slideshow. We can share the slide deck out with everyone who was registered for the event, and then we'll also have this recorded on the APA YouTube channel. We did get one more question too. Has the Met Council considered adding other systemic issues that may be making increased rental rates less affordable for renters? For example, differences in opportunities for advanced education, living wages, careers, ability to rent, to own, gain equity, keep up with economic growth, lower income. It's a lot of examples in that here, but in terms of, have you been thinking about, it sounds like yes, the answer is you've been thinking about some of these other factors, but do you have any way to talk about some of these additional indicators?
I think I would say that that it just points to the importance of recognizing that the broader regional system that creates these differences across places, both in the residents of these specific places are definitely impacted by the regional economy in society, as well as the external actors, organizations, nonprofits, businesses that invest in or do not invest in certain neighborhoods. So that is definitely important to take into account. It's I guess a bit harder to think of how to incorporate those specific features into a place-based data set, though. I guess I'd encourage you to go check out all the fields that are in there, because income, education, many of the things that were just mentioned do show up in the data set, even if those broader systemic generational forces are a lot harder to get at with existing data sources.
That's great. And We do have just a comment, and maybe I'll read the comment as you pull up the interactive activity so that we can get to that. But Jennifer says, I like the idea of focusing more on needs as opposed to defined categories when we look at data. However, there seems to be a reliance on place-based data. I wonder if there's an additional or supplemental tools we can use to fully understand needs and make it more person-centered through engagement. In the end, I think the goal is to influence policies, programs, and systems, some of which are place-based, but many have people-based outcomes, which spread across geographies.
Really agree with that comment, Jennifer. So I think we will go ahead and start our interactive, or like our live polling. And again, this is really about trying to better understand you and your needs and the ways in which you use data and information now, so that we can build tools for you, and not necessarily seek to find users for our tools, if that makes sense. So another way we're trying to be user-centered and people-centered. So if you could go to menti.com, you can also, if you have your phone handy, use the QR code here and pull it up and fill out the questions on your phone too, or you can open another tab in your browser. There's the code to enter when prompted. And I'm going to go ahead and Matt, if you want to pull up the results so folks can see the results here. Folks are already starting to take this first question, which is great, which is really just us wanting to better understand. We know that this primarily draws planners to the webinar today, but not exclusively. So we just wanted to better understand your role in workplace so we can contextualize what we hear about your interests in interactive tools. Looks like we have mostly jurisdiction planners here, which is great. We also have a great contingency of consultants and other folks. If you
Can I stop you, Kristen? I'm sorry. We have the need for the Menti code again. Could you pull that up? Sure. I'll throw it in the chat as well.
Yes, the Menti code is 1070961.
All right, perfect. Maybe we'll just give everyone a second to get in.
To jump over, yeah. If you did select something else, I would love to hear, what that something else is, just so we can better understand. If you want to just answer that in the chat, that would be fine. I don't have a way of getting that that open-ended question here, but that'd be helpful. Wonderful. We'll just give this a few more seconds. Okay. Describe your relationship to data. So, recognizing that, some of us are hands-on users where we're downloading that Excel file, we're wrestling it into GIS and using that information. Other times we have other colleagues on staff that do that kind of work. We can make requests of that, or sometimes a combination of both. So, just wanting to better understand that.
Kristen, I'm not seeing the results in my browser. I voted this time. I was thinking I might be able to see them, but I can't.
Oh. What if you hit refresh there, Matt, at the bottom?
Matt, I think you're taking it, and I'm not sure if there's a back end where you created the slide that you need to be logged into to be showing the results.
Actually, maybe, should I just share my screen then? Would that be helpful?
That would probably be easier, yeah.
Okay.
No, it sounds like you're muted, Kristen.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. And are we seeing results or not from the live polling?
We are.
Great, okay. I will move us on to the next question then. I know we are at time. This is an open-ended question about when might you seek the kinds of information that we showed you today in equity considerations. You know, when are you searching for information? What task are you undertaking? You know, at what stage of a process or a project? So, you know, just recognizing that our search for data can happen at for many different reasons and at many different times. So just wanting to unpack that a bit. And this is just going to sort of scroll through these open-ended responses. You can provide several options, as many as you can think of. Comp plan process, but not much outside of that. Developing public engagement plans, policy development, small area plans, investment allocation, writing grants, yep. Transportation studies, project impacts, yep.
Kristen, I'm not seeing at least the flowing grid, but it's helpful that you're reading it anyway, so not sure it's worth taking the time to fix it.
Okay, odd. Zoning code updates, any kind of planning project. Great, these are great responses. I am going to move us on just to the next question. I think this is a great sample of all the different opportunities to look for data. Just a really quick, you know, how important are some of the features that we provide in interactive tools? You know, we like them all, but we want to know specifically which of these capabilities in an interactive tool really matter to you and make it more valuable and useful to you in your work. Looks like mapping and customized charts, very highly rated. Analysis beyond descriptives, also highly rated. That we can download the data, definitely. A little, maybe less interest in some of those points of comparisons, but detailed documentation and clarity, ranking high. Well, I, for one, am glad to see that most of these things seem particularly valuable to all of you. That's great. Okay, I think we only have maybe one or two more questions. Where do you currently access data about your community, your jurisdiction, and its residents? You know, you might have in-house resources, you know, that you're using to do that, or you might be going to external websites and other interactive tools. So we're just curious to learn more about, you know, which tools and which types of resources. Yay, Met Council data. Glad to see that pop up. Minnesota Compass, also an excellent resource. County GIS departments, great. Directly from the US Census, interesting. Geospatial Commons, yes, what would we do without it? Okay, that's a great cross-section of information. Very flattered to see Met Council pop up there. Good to know we're doing good work on that. And then I think our last, well, this is our last rating question. I might actually just skip this one and move us on to what data are high priority for you when it comes to advancing equity. We certainly hope that equity considerations and equity considerations data set will have many of what we might see in this question, but yeah, when you're thinking about equity in your community, you know, what data maybe feel elusive or hard to find or are just a high priority for you to have? when you're thinking about that in any facet of your work. Housing types, excellent. Access to transit. Detailed demographics and socioeconomic information, employment. Green space, historic data on housing. Great. Well, I'm going to keep this poll open, so you are free to continue to offer your responses to this question. You know, we certainly want to make sure that we're being as inclusive in our data set as possible, again, without making it so unwieldy that we can't use it here. But this has been really helpful in informing us about what is a priority for you in interactive tools. And how you're currently using data and information. So we appreciate those responses. And my last prompt here is to invite you to complete this form if you'd like to be contacted and part of a user testing panel, we would love to have that. We'd love to have you. So I think that this will allow you to type in your name and email address. I don't see it here on my end, but I'm hoping that that feature's working. If not, please reach out to us. Matt and I have our contact information in the slide deck that will be shared. And we are very serious about making sure that the tools that we create with equity considerations really do further your work and conversations. So to do that, we need to hear from you and work with you on that. I think I will just close this, stop sharing my screen, and turn it back maybe to you, Peggy Sue.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kristen and Matt. That was an extremely good presentation. And it's so fun to hear about the work that you're doing and how you're continuing to improve it to make it more usable. I know we've used this data set here, and it's just can be so informative for people's work. So I want to thank you so much for your time. And I know we had quite a lot of people jump off, so hopefully they'll catch the end of this recording. Thank you again to Stantec for sponsoring this, and for the two of you for your time. Thank you so much.